something to hear now at 4:30.
Okay. Order, order. I call Gavin Sugar to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Paisley. I beg to move that this House has considered tackling demand for commercial sexual exploitation, jointly with my honourable friend, the member for Rotherham. Mr. Paisley, this can't go on. Our laws against commercial sexual exploitation are failing. They are failing to deter traffickers, failing to prevent pimps, those that profit, and they are failing victims. But crucially, we've known this for a long time. I've been fortunate to chair the all-party parliamentary group on prostitution and the global sex trade for around 6 or 7 years now. And I've grown increasingly frustrated that many political parties fail to engage with this issue because it forces you into a fundamental question: what you believe prostitution inherently to be. I personally have moved to a place where I feel it's a form of violence against women and girls that institutionalised exploitation for profit. But actually we are forced to examine that question, and that's what this debate here is about doing today. In 2014 we conducted an inquiry into prostitution laws in England and Wales. Our conclusion was stark, because the law sends no clear messages about the nature of prostitution and what the goal of legislation should be. It is by default the most visible, women who sell sex, who are targeted, while men who create the demand in the first place walk away without being held legally accountable for the immense damage that they do to individuals and communities.
Will you give way?
I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. To underline the point that he makes, isn't the fact that 50% of women who are in prostitution in the UK were estimated to have started being paid for sex acts before they were 18 years old. It really exposes more than anything the vulnerability of people in this trade, and how the kind of almost rosy image that's sometimes given to this is very far away from the reality of what faces it.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and this goes right to the heart of the question of consent. How can it be possible for someone to fail to consent under our current law the day before their 18th birthday, and then be in a position where consent is assumed to be free and given? I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and congratulate him obviously on securing this report. One of the areas, and I've watched documentaries around Europe, and when you're dealing with sex trafficking, or the slave trade for want of a better term, because women are forced into a form of slavery there, it breaks down on this point of prosecuting men, whether you just be a normal individual using a prostitute, or somebody that runs a gang, and that's where the weakness is. The law's got to be strengthened there, actually, start to tackle that. Would he not agree with me?
Well, of course, he's absolutely right, and as I'll go on to say, and other members will lay out, one of the biggest single drivers of trafficking into this country, of child sexual exploitation, is commercial sexual exploitation, which is why we need to take all measures that tackle those. Central to my argument, though, is that by failing to tackle demand, we continue to perpetuate the inequality where we focus on the most visible part of the transaction, not those that create the demand in the first place.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. I congratulate him and the honourable member for Rotherham during this debate, and also for all the work he does with the all-party group. You mentioned consent a few moments ago. There's a parallel issue of choice. Sometimes it's said there is a choice. Will you agree with me that there's more to this question of choice than initially meets the eye? And choice, in inverted commas, is often driven by poverty, or by addiction, or by abuse.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm extremely grateful for the honourable gentleman for making that exact point. There are all sorts of vulnerabilities that would cause someone who otherwise perhaps wouldn't normally choose to go into the very violent and difficult world of prostitution to do that. But we must take responsibility for all of those issues. Equally, prostitution is not a phenomenon driven by an oversupply of women, and I'm going to talk in gendered terms. It's a highly gendered phenomenon, although we accept, obviously, a wide variety of people that are also involved. It's not, I just make this point before I give way, it's not fundamentally caused by an oversupply of people growing up wishing to go into prostitution, but rather an oversupply of men who think it's acceptable to purchase sex and to drive the scale of this trade. I will give way.
thank my honourable friend, cooperative friend, for giving way, and I, congratulate him on this excellent case that he's making for this terrible problem of exploitation in our society. Would he agree with me, from looking at the cooperative analysis of the economy, that a lot of the issues are driven by insecure environments that women find themselves in, and particularly when it's a result of poverty, addiction, coercion, but also insecure work and 0 hours contracts and poor wages? All these things contribute to inward poverty and the need for, the reason for women actually find themselves in those situations.
Yeah. Once again, I find myself in complete agreement with my honourable friend as I go on to speak about a model of legal reform which is comprehensive, would be one not just where women that sell sex are decriminalised, who aren't subject to criminal sanction, but where the sex buyer is, but also programmes to boost exit and to allow people to go into other forms of work, much more secure forms of work, are really hugely important. Today, the Crown Prosecution Service rightly recognises women's involvement in prostitution as a form of sexual exploitation. Yet under existing law, women involved in street-based sexual exploitation are criminalised for loitering and soliciting, creating a barrier to exiting and rebuilding their lives. It's currently illegal to place a call card advertising prostitution in a phone box. Yet apparently it's perfectly legal for companies to make millions of pounds by knowingly hosting prostitution adverts online. We have an act in this country to combat modern slavery with a huge hole in it because it fails to acknowledge that prostitution drives sex trafficking in the first place. And we have a law that prohibits men soliciting women for sex on the streets, but gives them a green light to walk into a brothel and sexually exploit behind closed doors. That is not good enough. As I was making the point to the Minister this morning, who very kindly came before the Women and Equalities Committee, this doesn't just have a profound implication for women involved in prostitution, but for all women, because it perpetuates a myth that men have an absolute right to sex, and therefore that their sense of entitlement should overwhelm many others in society. The Minister for Women and Equalities, the Secretary of State, put it best when she said earlier this year, and I quote, "You cannot help and support people. You cannot give them hope and a chance. You cannot promote human rights or the dignity of every human being while paying them for sex, while funding an industry that exploits them." And I wholeheartedly agree. The United Nations, which is having to confront sexual abuse and exploitation within its own ranks, has published a glossary on sexual exploitation and abuse for anyone about who is not clear what it means. They state, sexual exploitation is a broad term which includes a number of acts described below, including transactional sex. Transactional sex defined as the exchange of money, employment, goods, or services for sex. Offering someone money, or drugs, or food, or a place to stay in exchange for them for performing sex acts is abusive and exploitative. It is never acceptable. The aim of our law must be to end commercial sexual exploitation, not to manage it. Not to regulate where it happens, not to simply pick up the pieces, or prevent those only most heinous acts. Our responsibility as lawmakers is clear: to end sexual exploitation. And to end the sexual exploitation, we have to end the demand. It's no big mystery how we combat demand. Just as with any other form of violence against women, it starts with the law sending out clear signals that exploiting someone by paying them for sex is never acceptable, and those who do will be held to account. We have to shift the burden of criminality from women that are exploited in the sex trade and place it where it belongs, on those that create the demand. Now, this end demand approach is often referred to as the Nordic or the sex buyer law. It's a three-pronged strategy which involves criminalising paying for sex, decriminalising selling sex, and providing support and exiting services for people exploited through the sex trade. France, the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, Iceland, and Norway have all adopted end demand legislation. The first country to do it, and this is important, was Sweden in 1999, which criminalised paying for sex and decriminalised selling it as part of a government bill to tackle violence against women. Mia de Feature, a survivor of prostitution, has said of Sweden's decision to introduce the law, "Prostitution is, was, and always will be an absolute affront to human dignity. And I know that because I've lived it and witnessed it. Sweden didn't do a radical thing or a controversial thing. Sweden just did the right thing in the name of freedom, justice and equality. And in this debate, colleagues will speak about the clear and substantial evidence that end-demand legislation works in Sweden and elsewhere. But I want to make this point to the Minister and to the government, that if neighbouring countries around us are adopting legislation that make it harder for people to be trafficked in, to be sexually exploited, on our streets and behind closed doors in every community that we represent, Britain runs the risk, England in particular, and Wales run the risk of being nations of which it is easier to traffic people into because there is such a clear basis on which money can be made. And therefore we cannot divorce ourselves from what is happening, this great move across much of Western Europe. It's sometimes claimed that paying for sex, making it a criminal offence, will drive prostitution, quotes, underground, and thereby make it inherently unsafe. Look, firstly, it's not possible to make sexual exploitation safe. The moment the money goes on the side or the counter, someone is buying consent, and that sex buyer believes they have an absolute right or entitlement. Secondly, as a recent European Commission study on trafficking points out, and I quote, there is a logical fallacy at the heart, since some level of visibility is required. In other words, if I can leave this room today and go and purchase sex by finding someone's details online, so the police can do as well. If sex buyers can locate women in prostitution, then so can the police and support services. To quote Detective Superintendent Kazel Wahlberg, Sweden's national rapporteur on trafficking in human beings, prostitution activities are not and cannot be pushed underground. The profit of traffickers, procurers and other prostitution operators is obviously dependent on that men easily can access women who they wish to purchase for prostitution purposes. If law enforcement agencies want to find out where prostitution activities take place, police can. And I make this simple point, that in Sweden they've been doing this now for nearly 20 years, and we can look at the evidence of what has happened in that country. I'll let others speak to that as well. Second myth I want to address in these opening remarks is that by fully decriminalising the sex trade, an argument advocated by some, including brothel keeping and pimping, it makes women safer. This couldn't be further from the truth. It legitimises and fuels demand, and demand is met by significantly increased levels of trafficking. A cross-sectional analysis of up to 150 countries found that trafficking flows are larger into countries where prostitution is legal, and that seems logical. Similarly, an analysis of European countries found that sex trafficking was most prevalent in nations with legalised prostitution regimes. The researchers suggested slacker prostitution laws make it more profitable to traffic persons to a country. Take the Netherlands, for example. Third-party profiteering was decriminalised there in 2000. 7 years later, the National Police Force estimated that between 50 and 90% of women in that country's legal prostitution trade, I quote, work involuntarily. An evaluation of the law in 2007, commissioned by the Dutch Parliament, found that pimping was still a very common phenomenon, does not seem to have decreased. Fieldwork researchers reported that a great majority of women in the Amsterdam famous window brothels work with a so-called boyfriend and pimp. And let me make this point, that there are very few women directly involved in selling sex that profit from it. That money is undoubtedly a huge supply, estimated by some at £5 or £6 billion of our economy. But that money is not finding its way into the pockets of women who are exploited through this trade. It ends up in the pockets of pimps, exploiters, and those that benefit from trafficking. I will.
Can I congratulate him on his speech and just say I'm using this intervention. I've been advised it will be inappropriate for me to speak today with certain things that are happening in West Yorkshire. And he knows I've been campaigning on this issue for a very long time. But this is my opportunity to say I'm here absolutely supporting you.
Extremely grateful. Mr. Paisley, the government cannot continue to kick this can down the road, and all of us to some degree are culpable on that. We need comprehensive legislative reform with the aim to tackle demand as its underlying principle. We have a duty as parliamentarians to confront and take action against sexual exploitation, however difficult or uncomfortable that may be. The government must tackle demand by criminalising paying for sex and decriminalising those that are exploited.
If members wish to remove their jackets, including the clerk and Hansard, they're entitled to do so because of the rudimentary cooling system that we have here. I'm going to unusually call Jenny Chapman from the same side because I know that she's been a significant... Sarah Champion, sorry, from the other side, because I know that she has been a very significant mover in getting this motion to the House. So I now call Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Paisley. It is not only a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, it is also a relief to be able to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank you for your kindness for enabling that to happen. Because we need to recognise that there is a crisis of commercial sexual exploitation in this country. The trafficking and exploitation of vulnerable women and girls around the UK to be sexually abused is taking place on an industrial scale. This is for one simple reason: demand. There are a minority of men in this country who are willing to pay to sexually access women's bodies. Currently, the law gives them licence to do this. For too long, Parliament has turned a blind eye to the suffering and societal carnage these men create. I am here today with two very clear messages for the Minister. One, there is sexual abuse scandal happening right now on your watch. It is enabled by prostitution advertising websites and driven by predominantly heterosexual men who pay for sex. Two, there is a solution: making paying for sex a crime to help stem demand, and then helping the woman exploited in the sex trade to exit by removing penalties for soliciting and providing with properly resourced support services. Government and the officials advising them cannot later claim they didn't know what was going on or were not aware of the scale of the problem. To end the exploitation, we have to end the demand. Let me contextualise the scale of this problem. A recent inquiry into organised sexual exploitation by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Prostitution and the Global Sex Trade, of which I am a member, found that sexual exploitation of women and girls by organised crime groups is widespread across the UK. There are at least 212 active, ongoing police operations into modern slavery cases involving sexual exploitation in the UK. Our inquiry suggests this represents just a small fraction of the true scale of organised sexual exploitation. While most police forces don't proactively work to identify all the brothels in their area, some do track them, and the scale they find is astonishing. Leicestershire Police visited 156 brothels, encountering 421 women in the year ending the 31st of December 2017. 86% of those women in the brothels were Romanian. Northumbria Police visited 81 brothels between March 2016 and April 2018. Of the 259 women they met in the brothels, 75% were Romanian. Over half of those brothels were recorded as connected to other brothels, agencies, or non-UK organised crime groups. Greater Manchester Police have identified 324 potential new brothel addresses since March 2015. They told our inquiry, and I quote, "The majority of those identified reflected the hotspot areas for modern slavery found in Greater Manchester." Let me quote Detective Sergeant Stuart Peel from Lancashire Constabulary. He said, "From what we can evidence, there nearly always appears to be a man or some sort of control involved. The females we encounter very rarely pay for their own advertisements or pay for their flights into the UK. There is clear organisation from what we have seen. The methods used by these organised crime groups to recruit women include deception, coercion, and the exploitation of women and girls' pre-existing vulnerabilities. Let's be clear. What women who are trafficked by organised crime groups, what they're being subjected to is not forced labour, it is rape. Based on evidence from the Poppy Project, Equality Now calculated that, on average, victims are exploited into prostitution for between 8 and 20 months. Most women trafficked in the UK reported being forced to have sex 6 or 7 days a week and seeing an estimated average of 13 sex buyers per day. From that, we can extrapolate that the average individual victim of trafficking for sexual exploitation is raped anywhere between 2,798 times to 6,828 times. Those rapes were committed by men who paid for sex. Scale that figure up to the 1,185 women referred to the National Referral Mechanism in 2017 for sexual exploitation. Then you start to see the scale of the problem. We must recognise that commercial sexual exploitation is part of a continuum of violence against women and girls. Commonly, this begins when they're just girls. Many women are involved in prostitution, have experienced different forms of abuse when they were children, often sexual. The grooming process and the beginning of a girl's experience of the continuum of violence is worth reflecting on. For many girls, this begins with something seemingly innocent, getting a slightly older boyfriend, going for car rides with that boyfriend. Things then become more risky, drinking alcohol or smoking cannabis at the insistence of the boyfriend. Then the pressure to return the favour with sexual acts begins. Very quickly, and we have seen this repeatedly happening in my constituency of Rotherham, this becomes organised sexual exploitation. The girls are passed between adult men who systematically sexually exploit them in the most horrific ways. Since the events in Rotherham came to light, attitudes in the UK have started to shift towards recognising that these girls are not prostitutes, willingly choosing to sell their bodies, but instead they are victims, exploited by men operating in gangs. Now that child sexual exploitation is viewed as a national crisis, it's time for us to recognise that sexual exploitation does not stop when you are 18. Instead, for the girls who don't get the support that they need to escape and repair their lives, they continue to be sexually exploited, perhaps by the same organised gangs or by pimps into their 20s, 30s and beyond. Finally, after years of campaigning, we consider the grooming and subsequent sexual exploitation of a child to be abhorrent. But we must ask why, when they turn 18, society's attitude is that they are suddenly consenting adults, making a choice about selling sex, even when we are aware of the past childhood abuse or the trafficking, slavery, coercive control, intimidation, violence or drugs and alcohol dependencies that are there in the background. Let's confront the fact that when we talk about prostitution, the term free choice rarely, if ever, accurately describes a person's path into the sex trade. Sometimes we are talking about girls who have not escaped their early life trauma, perhaps in and out of care, maybe groomed under the influence of drugs in their teens, someone who's been repeatedly raped and sexually assaulted throughout their lives. If this sounds emotive, it is correlated by supporting statistics. Home Office research shows 50% of women became involved in prostitution before the age of 18, in their study showing with 3 out of 4 involved aged under 21. Another study by the Home Office in 2006 showed that 70% of women had spent time in care and 45% had previously experienced sexual abuse. Do we really believe someone can give informed consent when many of these women and girls are inherently vulnerable or trapped in a cycle of abuse? The scale of commercial sexual exploitation is happening on a staggering scale. A key enabler to this is prostitution procurement websites, where women are advertised to sex buyers. A buyer can go to sites such as Viva Street or Adult Work, casually search for women in his area and contact the mobile number provided. Then they arrange an appointment. It's quick, it's easy, and it's highly profitable for the web companies. The Joint Slavery and Trafficking Analysis Centre, which is hosted by the National Crime Agency, say these prostitution websites, and I quote, represent the most significant enabler of sexual exploitation in the UK. Claims that the sites enhance women's safety are deeply misguided. Prostitution advertising websites significantly increase the ease and scale of organised sexual exploitation in this country. Thankfully, other countries have now started to act. Since the United States signed into law the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act earlier this year, Adult Work and a host of other sites have shut down their prostitution adverts there. In France, the Paris prosecutor has launched an official investigation into Viva Street on charges of aggravated pimping. which in turn has since shut down its prostitution adverts in France. Here in Britain, our inadequate laws against commercial sexual exploitation prohibit a person from placing a call card for prostitution in a phone booth, but allow companies like Viva Street to make millions advertising women online. This has to change urgently. This week, Viva Street claimed that it is, I quote, working closely with the Home Office to help develop an industry-wide approach to identifying and preventing online trafficking. That is not enough. The government must take on corporate pimps, not collaborate with them. Our law needs to be updated so it clearly sets out that it is a criminal offence to facilitate or profit from someone else's prostitution. It is already an offence to buy sex from a person who has been subject to force, coercion or exploitation by a third party under Section 53A of the Sexual Offences Act 2003. This means it does not have to be proved that the buyer was aware of the exploitation of the person they were paying for sex with. Sadly though, 2017 research by Dr. Andrea Motolzi of Bristol University suggested that there was only a low level of awareness of the offence and that the maximum fine of £1,000 was not deterring buyers. Our current laws are simply not fit for purpose. To reduce demand for prostitution and sex trafficking, the law has to send a clear message that it is never acceptable to exploit someone by paying them for sex. To do that, the government should urgently extend the existing prohibition against paying for sex in a public place to make it a criminal offence in all locations. While prostitution websites facilitate commercial sexual exploitation, they are not the root cause of it. The root cause is the demand. Most men do not pay for sex. It is just a minority who do. A study of 6,000 men by University College London found that 3.6% of men reported having paid for sex in the last 5 years. The men who are more likely to have paid for sex were young professionals with high numbers of unpaid sexual partners, squashing the myth that the sex trade is a place of last resort for the lonely few. It is the demand of these men that drives the supply of mainly vulnerable women and girls into the sex trade. It's the money of these buyers that lines the pockets of the pimps and the traffickers. The sex trade and all the harm and suffering it entails exists because of them. Let me be clear, paying someone to perform sex acts on you is abuse, just as exchanging accommodation, employment, services or other goods in return for sex is sexual abuse. A man who pays for sex is not a regular consumer innocently availing a worker of their services. Offering someone money or goods or services for sex is sexual coercion. It is a form of violence against women. Globally, 96% of victims of sexual exploitation are women and girls. When people pay for sex, they undergo a convenient act of forgetting. Only 44% of sex buyers taking part in a London-based study felt that prostitution had a very or extremely negative impact on women. This shows that many of those who pay for sex ignore that the women they pay for are likely to be vulnerable. They ignore that she may be in desperate need of money to pay debts to her pimp, that she has little or no agency in the situation. They do not think about the life events that led a woman to be in a brothel as opposed to working in an office or a shop. There's rightly been outrage at the recently publicised cases of men working for aid agencies who've been exploiting vulnerable women overseas by paying them for sex. But where is the outrage when they come back to this country and sexually abuse in our own backyard? Across the UK, men are paying to sexually exploit vulnerable women and girls that they have shopped for online. We need to join the dots between prostitution, modern slavery, sex trafficking, and child sexual exploitation. The common thread is men who pay to sexually access women and girls' bodies. There is no separate and distinct market for specifically sex trafficked victims. The market is for sex. Detective Constable Julie Curry of the Met Police Modern Slavery and Kidnapping Unit told the APPG, and I quote, "In the vast majority of cases, males paying for sex will give no thought to where the woman has come from, or what circumstances have led her into prostitution. And as Dr. Maggie Coy from the Florida University states, I quote, "Policy approaches which presume a distinct market for the purchase of girls' bodies for sex from that of the adult women are blinkered into the myriad of connections that span the age of majority. What links these forms of exploitation is the men who pay to abuse women and girls, their sexist attitude of entitlement and objectification, and the sex inequality that underpins it. Crucially, we need to acknowledge that there is nothing inevitable about this exploitation, that we can and must take action to tackle demand from men who exploit vulnerable people by paying for sex. So I say to the Minister today, to reduce the demand for prostitution and sex trafficking, the law has to send a clear message that it is never acceptable to exploit someone by paying for sex. To do that, the government should urgently extend the existing prohibition against paying for sex in a public place to make it a criminal offence in all locations. At the same time, it is vital that people exploited through prostitution are not criminalised, but are instead supported to exit and access the services they need. As such, penalties for loitering and soliciting should be removed from the statute book. This end-demand approach to prostitution is often referred to as the Nordic model, or sex buyers law. It has so far been adopted in Sweden, in Norway, in France, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and so it's already in operation on UK soil. We urgently need to extend this legislation to the rest of the UK. There is extensive evidence of the effectiveness of the sex buyers law in tackling demand. In Sweden, the first country to adopt an end-demand approach back in 1999, anonymous surveys conducted in 1996 and 2008 revealed that the proportion of men in Sweden who reported paying for sex dropped from 13 to 8%. The most recent study conducted on prevalence rates found that 0.8% of men in Sweden had paid for sex in the previous 12 months, the smallest proportion recorded in 2 decades, and the lowest in Europe. Crucially, public attitudes have changed. In 1996, 45% of women and 20% of men in Sweden supported criminalising paying for sex. By 2008, the support for this had risen to 79% amongst women and 60% amongst men. That is the point of the law. It changes attitudes and prevents commercial sexual exploitation happening in the first place. Reducing demand also makes countries more hostile for traffickers. A review of the sex buyers law in Norway concluded, I quote, "A reduced market and increased law enforcement posits larger risks for human traffickers. The law has thus effectively an important pull factor and reduces the extent of human trafficking in Norway in comparison to a situation without a law." Similarly, the head of Stockholm Police Prostitution Unit points out, I quote, "How will the traffickers survive without the sex buyers? The sex buyers are the crucial sponsors of organised crime. The sex buyers, the traffickers, are not into this because of the sex, they're into this because of the money. Paying to sexually access another person's body is a choice to abuse. The law must serve as a deterrent and send a clear message that society will not stand idly by while a minority of men exploit vulnerable women and girls. Changing the law around selling and buying of sex is crucial to prevent sexual exploitation. There are other ways we can reduce demand too. We should seek to change the attitudes towards women, exploitation and abuse through education. We need to confront the uncomfortable truth that many children are being groomed into sexual exploitation from an early age, so we really need age-appropriate relationship education in primary schools. When it comes to tackling the demand for commercial sexual exploitation, we should be educating boys about respecting women's bodies, about gender-based violence, and about negative gender stereotypes. That's why I'm very sad that last week the Secretary of State for Education rolled back on his commitment to bring in relationship education in 2019. It's now going to be, hopefully, in 2020. Providing routes out of commercial sexual exploitation is also important. Solutions are required that provide wraparound care at the moment a woman presents in crisis. The proposed modern slavery bill, which aims to provide up to 12 months of rehabilitative care, recovery and support for victims, could be vital in ensuring that vulnerable women and girls are fully supported in their exit from prostitution. In line with this, the government needs to properly fund sexual violence support services, such as Rape Crisis, who are struggling to keep up with demand. As a Member of Parliament for Rotherham, I've borne witness to what happens when confronted with the evidence of widespread sexual abuse, those in authority have looked away. When they have described the exploitation as a choice, when they have dismissed it, they have minimised it, known about it, but failed to do all they could to prevent it. We have a duty to act now, not look away. It's time for this government to recognise that prostitution is a form of violence against women and girls. I urge the Minister to legislate now to end demand by criminalising those who pay for sex and closing the loophole that enables websites to facilitate the abuse. Being abused is not a choice, but our seeming indifference to it is.
Call the next member, who will be Fiona Bruce. I don't intend to put a formal time limit. I think everyone will have time to speak, provided they bear in mind that I intend to call the first wind-up at 3:28, and so members have about 6 or so minutes without a formal time limit. I call Fiona Bruce.
Leslie, can I commend the speeches of the members for Rotherham and Luton, my colleagues in the all-party group, and say how much I wholeheartedly support those powerful expressions of support for women who are in prostitution and are trapped in prostitution. Often referred to as the oldest profession, but more accurately viewed as one of the most enduring forms of exploitation. It's been my privilege to meet and talk with many women who've lived through prostitution. The stories they tell have been treated as an object or commodity, and a feeling they had no choice but to sell sex in order to survive are a sobering contrast to the fictional glamour in the popular myths surrounding this industry. As one of these survivors, Rachel Moran has written in her excellent autobiographical book, Paid For: My Journey Through Prostitution, she says, "I pay no respect or accommodation to the glamorising or sensationalising of prostitution. These are not true depictions of prostitution. My assessment of prostitution and my opinions of it I take from the years I spent enduring it and everything I ever saw, heard, felt, witnessed or otherwise experienced at that time. There was no glamour there, not even the flicker of it, not for any of us. No one reading Rachel's book could otherwise believe that women involved in prostitution are abused women. No one could believe that this is an utterly exploitative experience. And as we've heard, circumstances in early years such as homelessness, family breakdown, problems with drug or alcohol, or being in local authority care are so often precursors to young people entering prostitution, which then becomes a trap for years. Certainly, Sean.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving me. I too have met Rachel more than once and read her book, and it is truly compelling. Will she say a little bit more about the evidence that she heard on the Commission, which we both heard on the Commission, on this issue of choice, and the fact that it's wrong to describe this as a choice or a genuine choice, because there are so many underlying reasons for it that it would be wrong to say that those in prostitution are there out of choice?
Absolutely, and I thank my honourable friend for raising that point. The fallacy with the argument that women, and it is mainly women, engaged in prostitution who are being paid for sex are consenting is that they are never consenting, they are coerced. They are coerced by the circumstances such as those I've described, which are then exploited by those who use them for sex and the pimps who sell them for sex. Research for the Scottish Government has shown that most respondents who provide services and support those involved in prostitution say that there is a wide range of risks and adverse impacts associated with prostitution. Short and long term, mental health, their safety, their sexual health, the loss of self through being objectified time and time again is something which profoundly comes across when one talks about women who've been involved in prostitution. The techniques that they operate to block out from their mind what is happening to them so that they think of themselves as an object are so profound that they cannot then move on from this often when they endeavour to move on with their lives. And although some British nationals, especially young people, are affected. Commercial sexual exploitation does now, as we've heard, so often affect foreign nationals who've been trafficked here, who are vulnerable. A Police Foundation study in Bristol found that just 70% of the people providing sexual services in that city's brothels were British. Prostitution and the commercial sex industry are intrinsically linked with modern slavery. And as we've heard, the market for commercial sex operates as a pull for traffickers and organised crime groups. And it is heartrending when one hears of accounts from organisations like Hope for Justice, because I actually believe that the daily figure of 13 that the Honourable Lady for Rotherham was given is often a gross underestimate. I remember an account from the founder of Hope for Justice, which rescues trafficked women from prostitution, saying that on one occasion he was told about a young girl who'd been rescued, who decided that one day she would count how many men had abused her that day. After 100, she stopped counting. To reduce modern slavery, we must reduce the demand that creates the market in which so many people are exploited. And that's why I so support what has been said. We must end the demand. And at the same time, we must also provide real exit routes for the women who are trapped within prostitution. It's not enough just to say, you can have health checks, you can have clean condoms. They need to have genuine opportunities to gain education, to be rehoused, to understand how they can support themselves in a different way when often they see that they have no alternatives at all. The Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, which I chair, is in the middle of its own inquiry into the question of the different legal approaches to prostitution and how these impact the fight against modern slavery. And I'm very pleased to see the evidence that's coming through now from countries where end demand legislations have been implemented, including in Northern Ireland, where the law is fairly new, but the police have found this offence much more effective than the partial offence that existed before, which we still have here. And I do want to congratulate the Public Prosecution Service there on securing their first conviction in a contested court case following the implementation of this new law just 2 weeks ago. And it's quite right, the culture has been changed in Sweden, as we've heard. It's now considered almost demeaning to have to pay for sex there. And isn't that right? Only a minority of men in this country do pay for sexual services. Only around 11% of men have ever paid for sex. Only 3.6% have done so in the past years, up to the most recent survey data published. But their behaviour harms individuals, it fuels organised crime, and it contributes to the global networks of modern slavery. Many people suggest the law should not intervene into matters of prostitution, saying that would stray into regulating the behaviour of consenting adults. But as we've heard, one of those people, and they're often not an adult, is not consenting. The law needs to be looked at again. If the cost of protecting such extremely vulnerable people from exploitation and modern slavery is to reduce the choices of a small group of people, then that is a cost I believe we should be prepared to pay. Now, in closing, I do want to welcome the research the government has commissioned into the nature of prostitution in England and Wales and commend the Minister for her own interest in this subject. I believe that the research will be into the scale and nature of prostitution in the 21st century in the UK, and I look forward to the findings of that report. Then I hope that perhaps during the course of the summer recess, the Minister will have an opportunity to read Rachel Moran's book, and the researchers who are undertaking work into that inquiry will look at this too.
Jim Shannon.
Pleasure to speak in this issue, which I have a great interest in. First of all, I'm going to congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Luton South and the Honourable Lady for Rotherham and setting the scene. And perhaps just to give the Northern Ireland perspective, Mr. Paisley, to where we are and what we've done in Northern Ireland legislatively when we had the power, and what I suggest to the Minister that she would need to do here in the mainland, because that's the way forward. Just 2 weeks ago, a court in Northern Ireland convicted a man in the first case to be contested under legislation that just in the 2015, under which it is an offence to pay for, or in this particular case, attempt to pay for sexual services of another person. One might be forgiven for thinking this has taken some time for the first conviction to be made. But in addition to this, data kept up to the end of March this year records 13 individuals that have been cautioned or received another discretionary disposal having admitted their guilt. Would I like to see the PSNI making greater use of this offence? Yes, I certainly would, and so would you, Mr. Paisley. However, these arrests show that this simple offence is much more effective than the more complex offence which we had before. Previously, our law targeted curb crawlers who seek to buy sex in public and all those who purchase sexual services from a person subjected to force laws which England and Wales still have. The curb crawling offence has limitations because it can only address those who seek to purchase sex in a public place. And yet research suggests that the majority of prostitution in the UK now happens indoors, in brothels, in private residences and hotels. The offence that applies where a person is subjected to force is difficult to apply because although there is no requirement that the offender knows about the coercion, there does need to be proof that the coercion is happening, something that is not always easy to document in the time required by a relatively low-level offence. PSNI statistics show that no one was arrested or charged for this offence the whole time that it operated before. So the change of legislation has given the PSNI the power to do just that, to change attitudes and to make sure that we can make a change. And I suggest, respectively to the Minister, that's the changes we need here on the mainland and in Wales. Yeah.
I'll be very brief. Some of the objections to the sex buyers law is that it's only been seen in Nordic countries that have a different jurisdiction from our own. The examples that he is giving are particularly powerful because it shows that our own jurisdiction can cope with these laws and that it does work.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. We changed the law in Northern Ireland because we needed laws that would enable us to tackle the demand for commercial sexual exploitation more effectively. The Northern Ireland Assembly overwhelmingly supported this provision by 81 votes to 10, with the four largest parties in the Assembly, the DUP, the Sinn Féin, SDLP and Ulster Unionists, supporting this move. Both Unionists and Nationalists supported the legislation for the change. Lord Morrow, who's in the House of Lords now but was a member of the Assembly at that time, was one of those who did the good work. People are moved easily around the UK, across the border with the Republic of Ireland and more widely within Europe. Germany and the Netherlands, which have legalised prostitution, have become destination countries for so-called sex tourists and also for traffickers and their victims. Legislation has not stamped out organised crime or trafficking, and it hasn't worked there. And what we need is a change that we have in Northern Ireland. It's a change that should be here. Fighting sex trafficking using the criminal system may even be harder in the legalised prostitution sector. So we might ask, why tackle the demand at all? The simple answer is that without the demand for paid sex, there would be no need for a continuous supply of women tricked, bullied or forced by circumstances into prostitution. Reducing the demand is a key to reducing the number of people who end up in commercial sexual exploitation and reduce human trafficking. I want to give you a quotation from a lady who addressed the Northern Ireland Assembly but came here to do the same thing as well. And her name is Mia Defisha. She later spoke powerfully at an event in Stormont to make the coming into force of the offence of purchasing sex. She spoke in this House as well. I'm going to quote her, and this will be my last quotation, for I'm very conscious two people to come after me and I want to make a contribution as well. It is my firm belief that everybody on this island, be they born here or not, is entitled to live a dignified life. And prostitution is a systematic stripping of one's human dignity. And I know that because I have lived and witnessed it. She was one of those. And it must no longer be tolerated. And now in Northern Ireland, the next generation of girls will grow up knowing that their bodies to which they have been born into are respected and at no time will they ever be for sale. She made those comments at Westminster in an event that took place here, which I co-hosted with the Honourable Lady for Congleton and the former member for Slough as well. Women and girls across the whole of the UK deserve that same freedom. Northern Ireland has led the way in the British Isles. The Republic of Ireland follows suit. It's now time for England, Scotland and Wales to join us. Take action to tackle the demand for commercial sexual exploitation is the first step. And I would encourage the Minister to follow the actions of those in Northern Ireland. It's a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shannon. Can I call Ronnie Cowan?
Mr. Paisley, I shall keep it short and hopefully get the honourable for Birmingham Yard left on our feet. While gathering my thoughts to this debate, I was reminded by a number of people on the importance of the terminology I use and the language I adopt. What I've discovered is that two people, or indeed two groups of people on the same side of this debate, can and do disagree on the language and the terminology. Past experience tells me that as a man, I'm walking on eggshells, but we shall never change the world for better if we can't enter into an open and honest debate on issues that matter. And this issue matters, and we all want a better world. Therefore, I apologise to those I may be about to offend. It's not my intention to disrespect you or your views. but these are my views as a man attempting to help a world when people, primarily women, are abused by men. Most sex buyers are male, and this group predominantly pays to sexually access the bodies of women. Therefore, I think it's important that young men are raised not to see women as a commodity that can be bought and sold. If we don't address that, then, as has happened in other countries, to supply the demand, women will be trafficked and sold into a deeply exploitative trade. A 5-country study of men who paid for sex, led by the Immigration Council of Ireland, concluded, irrespective of a buyer's knowledge of human trafficking as a crime and as a phenomenon, it is unlikely that they will consider the possibility that as a seller may be a victim of trafficking when purchasing sex. We need to educate those doing the buying, and we need to educate them before they even start. The overwhelming majority of people exploited through the sex trade are highly vulnerable even before they become involved and suffer acute harm as a result. Prostitution is about violence and control. Maya, 4 or 5 people have butchered your second name already this afternoon. Maya Defoy, an activist and survivor of prostitution, said when asked why men pay for sex, I think it's partly the fact that they can, and society says they can, and the law says that they can. You must ask yourself, what are they buying? It's power. It's a very powerful thing to have control over someone else's body in that way. It's a powerful fix, and they know it. We can legislate and maybe get it right, in which case we help, if not completely resolve the situation. If we legislate and get it wrong, we could drive prostitution underground, and that would be disastrous for those being trafficked and abused. Criminalising paying for sex or decriminalising selling sex has been shown to reduce demand for sexual exploitation, change public attitudes, and make countries more hostile destinations for traffickers. In recognition of centrality of combating demand and preventing sex trafficking, the Council of Europe recommended states adopt this approach as the most effective tool for preventing and combating trafficking in human beings. And while I acknowledge that it is not perfect, I believe it's the best path forward. The only way we guarantee resolving this is if we reduce the demand to zero. Demand for prostitution is not inevitable. Prevalence rates vary over time and between countries. Demand is context dependent, based on a decision-making process by each man who pays to sexually exploit someone. Mr. Paisley, in conclusion, most men do not pay for sex. It's a minority who do. We should have a UK-wide education programme that counteracts the growing normalisation of sexual exploitation. Through a concerted body of education, we should aim to create a society where the concept of buying a person is simply inconceivable.
Yes, Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Paisley. It is, as ever, a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I just want, first of all, to start to ask the Minister to reflect on the fact that currently in the larger chamber of this House, the government is taking action in a bill to stop the sale of part of an animal from other countries, and to reduce that demand in ivory is legislating and acting with a bill. At exactly the same moment that goes on, there are women face down being abused in this country who have been trafficked from somewhere else or exploited here. To me, I'm sure ivory is a very important thing. It's not as important as the girls who are in my kids' class, and it never ever will be. So I would ask the government to act and not keep kicking this into a review after review, because we can act with elephants, we should act for women. So I normally spend time giving voice to victims in this place, or to women, and standing up and speaking the voices of people who've got in touch with me. Today I want to give voice to some of the punters of sex work to try and prove that paying for sex is not like any other service. It is an abuse, and Mr. Paisley, I would like to apologise because some of it isn't particularly pleasant. So here are 3 quotes from men who reviewed women and they had exploited on the prostitution review website, Punternet. This is a classic case of the pretty ones don't have to work very hard. Vicky is beautiful, but frankly can't be arsed. She's Polish and her English is not good. I was reminded of the Smiths song, Girlfriend in a Coma. All the while she seemed completely disinterested and mechanical. After a while, during which she remained completely unresponsive, I offered to lick her. She was stubbly, which I didn't like. but carried on regardless and got the same lack of response. I finally decided to fuck her in Mish. Her pussy was hot and tight and I came after less than 10 minutes. All the while, she kept her face turned to one side. Very pretty and young girl, approximately 165 centimetres tall. Nice legs and beautiful breasts, nice skin. Very young. If you want to try a fresh young one, say she's 18 and pretty, the girl is okay, but maybe she's only just started working. She's quite passive, she scarcely kisses without tongue and doesn't want to be kissed on the neck or ears. Can't do a decent blowjob and really rides badly on you. I had to stop her several times when she tried to use her mouth or when she got up on me. She really can't speak a word of English. I think she's Romanian or something like that. Her English is 0. Saw this girl's picture on another site and thought she looked nice. How wrong I was. She does not offer any of the services offered and actually had the cheek to ask for more money to perform things that she was advertising as part of her services. Her attitude was derisory. I did have sex with her. It was a bit like shagging a blow-up doll. I should have asked for my money back, but given the very dodgy-looking bloke with her, with an aggressive dog downstairs, I thought it probably best just to get out as quick as possible. Lovely. So that's just like any service, and I would ask any member of this house to think about their daughters, their wives, their mothers, the women who live in their constituencies, and the idea of people speaking about them like that. There is a significant parallel between domestic violence and prostitution, and the APPG found that the boyfriend model, as described by my friend from Rotherham, is a very common one to coerce women in existing relationships into the sex trade. It's fairly uncommon that people get caught for it, but the following text message conversation is between two men who were convicted of sex trafficking in the UK last year. The conversation is between Razvan Mitru, the lead member of a trafficking gang, and Alexandra Pitigoy. They are discussing recruiting Pitigoy's girlfriend to brothels in the UK and openly acknowledging what they want to do. Pitigoy says, "Let me talk to her too, because she really doesn't want me anymore." Mitru, "Why?" "Because she's not happy about it." Mitru, "What the fuck is she not happy about?" Pitigoy, "She doesn't like it. As you can imagine, it's hard for her, bro." Mitru, "She doesn't have a penny in her pocket and she's being fussy. Maybe it's hard for her, but if she's fucked, at least she knows that it's not for nothing." Pitigoy, "I know that. I have met this woman hundreds and hundreds of times." A review isn't enough. I asked for the Minister to do everything that was laid out by my friends from Luton and Rotherham, and I ask her to do it now.
I call the first opposition spokesperson, Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Mr Paisley. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I would like to congratulate the honourable members for Rotherham and Luton South, who have both campaigned relentlessly on this issue and on securing this important debate. It is unfortunate that we have this debate on this chamber when we should, I think, be having this debate in the main chamber of the House, and too often do we have these important discussions first of all in this chamber when we really should and deservedly should have this conversation on the floor of the House. Now, as we've heard already, prostitution is a form of gendered violence, and it is both a cause and a consequence of sexual inequality. It's interesting that this debate so far has focused not purely on tackling commercial exploitation, but particularly on demand. As we have heard from the honourable members for Luton South and Rotherham, it is the demand for sex buyers that fuels sex trafficking and organised crime. Without the demand for sex buyers, there would be no need for supply. We are therefore looking at tackling the root cause of the forms of sexual inequality rather than the symptom. The demand for commercial sexual exploitation is not an inevitable fact. Most men do not pay for sex, and figures for those who do vary over time and between different countries. But the fact is, it is predominantly men who pay for sex, and those who do, while they are in the minority, make a conscious choice to do so. Now, as the honourable member for Congleton quoted the words of Rachel Moran, there is no glamour in prostitution, and there is of course a false element of choice. The majority of people who are in this are exploited through the sex trade, are highly vulnerable, and before they come into the sex industry often suffer acute harm as a result. Now, we've heard already a number of statistics, and I don't want to bore you with further statistics, but it's estimated that 152 sex workers were murdered between 1990 and 2015. And while sex workers are often victims of violent crime, incidents go unreported to the police. Now, if that's the only statistics we have on murder, I hate to think how many times a day women are sexually exploited and physically abused because of this industry. Now, my honourable friend for Inverclyde rightly points out that the only way to begin to tackle this, as the Right Honourable Member for Rotherham, I might have just promoted you there, so no, you are Right Honourable. It's absolutely essential that we educate young men and boys. Now, we have already heard that this is an issue of violence against women and abuse of power. But as you've heard from the Honourable Member for Birmingham Yardley, the words of these men are not only abhorrent, but it signifies that if that's even the language they use, I dread to think that the treatment of these women on a daily basis is unimaginable. Now, of course, this is not an issue that's exclusive to this jurisdiction, and in the Scottish Government we do recognise that prostitution as a form of violence is a form of violence, and as a result the Equally Safe campaign in Scotland seeks to create a strategy to prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls. Now, the Humane Trafficking and Exploitation Scotland Act in 2015 introduced legislation to specifically make it an offence to exploit another human being, and exploitation is defined within the Act and covers exploitation and makes specific provision for support and assistance to victims of trafficking. There are clear links between human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, and there have been suggestions from Europol representatives that trafficking in human beings, particularly women and girls, has increased in countries where prostitution has been legalised, as we've heard repeatedly. Now, I do not believe for a single second that this goes far enough, and that's why I advocate not only to Scotland and to the Minister here in this House, but across the UK, that we do more. And I do think we should lead by the example of Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, who have taken swift action in this regard. This means we must be careful not to allow this form of abuse to increase as a result of measures which we aim to protect the victims of that abuse. Now, to quote the Honourable Member for Rotherham, this is a crisis of commercial sexual exploitation on an industrial scale, and more must be done to protect the vulnerable individuals from this criminal activity. It cannot and it must not go on, and I hope that the Minister will pay heed to the comments across this House and take further action in this regard.
Call the Frontbench Labour spokesperson in this debate.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Paisley, and I'd like to congratulate all speakers for their very passionate and moving speeches. I, for one, am extremely moved by them. Prostitution is a nationwide issue. Women are selling their bodies on the streets. Up and down the country, they're putting their health and their safety at risk. Prostitution is violence against women and girls. Each time a woman is met by a purchaser to trade a sex act for money, drugs, food or some other commodity, she is potentially in a life-endangering situation. Prostitution causes damage to those in it, and it can never ever be really completely safe. It is abuse of vulnerable women, and I want to tell you a story about last summer when I spent quite a lot of time in Swansea talking to women who were actually engaged in prostitution, victims of prostitution. And I met one lady who had 30 years ago lost her daughter, a 6-year-old daughter, in a road accident. 30 years ago I lost my 8-year-old son in a road accident. 30 years ago she turned to alcohol and drugs to numb the pain because she didn't have any support and she didn't have any family, and she ended up having something to take the edge off it, and that led her into prostitution. I thankfully had a loving family around me, and I was closeted and nurtured, and I'm standing here today. But that maxim, there by the grace of God, is so true, and we do not know what's around the corner. I also noted that she was heavily bruised. She's in her late 50s. And I commented that she had really bad facial scarring and bad black eyes. She said this happens all the time. This is because I didn't give good service. So these women held themselves entirely responsible for not giving the service that is demanded of them by the purchasers. And young women and girls on the street or in backstreet brothels, they're selling their bodies for as little as £5, or in exchange for drugs and alcohol, and in some cases food or a bed for the night. And these women are not dressed in expensive clothes and fancy shoes. They're in grubby tracksuits and trainers. And the idea that prostitution is a choice women have is simply not true. People are pushed into exploitative and harmful situations because they're trying to survive. We must understand and address the root cause of prostitution, which is normally man's demand for sex. Using prostitutes has become so normalised that men now go to brothels with their friends before a night out. And the stigma of men paying for sexual service has vanished. And yet the stigma for women selling their body still remains. The Sex Buyer Guide, as we've heard, to prostitution decriminalises all those who are prostituted, and it provides support services to help them exit, and it makes people buying sex a criminal offence in order to reduce the demand that drives sex trafficking. It makes it clear that buying people for sex is abhorrent and it is wrong, and it sanctions that discourages people from doing it. Education programmes in schools, training for police and other emergency services and frontline professionals is vital in targeting offenders of sex trafficking and helping the women who need support. The lack of understanding could be putting these women straight back into the hands of their abusers. And every woman I've met who's been involved in prostitution, it's there because she's repeatedly gone back into the same abusive relationship time after time, as it was her only option. There was nothing else for her. Women need to feel that they have a place to go and they have help and support, and that people are available to help them break the cycle. Women involved in prostitution should have access to excellent, reliable and life-changing information and support. They should be treated fairly, positively and most importantly, respectfully. And they should be given genuine alternatives to a life of prostitution, regardless of where they find themselves. If this is not provided, these women will never, ever break out from the situation that they're in. Britain must become a hostile place for sex traffickers and other third-party profiteers of sexual exploitation. This requires a holistic approach that puts prevention at its heart, while mobilising all available measures to disrupt and robustly respond to sexual exploitation. There is no other argument other than prostitution is violence against women and girls, and we must always fight to protect women and girls from living a life of violence and abuse. These women need our help and support. They don't need prison sentences. They don't need criminal records. They need our help, and they need it now.
Minister, I now call Minister Victoria Atkins.
Thank you, Mr Paisley. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I thank the honourable members for Rotherham and for Luton South for securing this important debate on tackling demand for commercial sexual exploitation. I think we have a full public gallery. I'm sure it's being watched on television as well, and the accounts given have clearly touched many people and have said in an incredibly compelling way the risks, the harms, the agony that prostitution can cause those who are most vulnerable. I would like to thank as well the APPG for its work in this area. I'm pleased to see so many of the APPG's members here today, and to thank it for its report, which I have read with great care. And I'd like to thank honourable members for the way in which they have addressed the House in a way that is both compelling but also very, very hard-hitting. the honourable member, my honourable friend for Congleton, talked about the fallacy of choice and the loss of self. These are phrases that very much were borne out in the honourable member for Birmingham Yardley's quotations from websites and the honourable member for Swansea East's own description of a lady whose life path changed 30 years ago and who has suffered the terrible, terrible consequences of that. And I thank also the honourable member for Strangford, who has brought into this chamber the developments that are occurring in Northern Ireland. I thank him for that, and I will be watching with interest the results of that change in their law. The government's priority is to protect those selling sex from harm and exploitation and to target those who exploit vulnerable people involved in exploitation. Indeed, just this afternoon, along the corridor, there is a group of people meeting to discuss how we can prevent exploitation in hand car washes. We know that nail bars are another area rich for exploitation, but of course the most difficult area of exploitation, I think, is the sex industry and the industry involving adults and children. I come to this drawing on my experience outside of this house. I used to prosecute serious organised crime, but I remember a woman who I defended many years ago. She was caught because she had an illegal documentation. This is back in the 2000s, when we had a different attitude towards victims of slavery then. Sadly, we have much improved it since, I'm pleased to say. But she had been caught because she had fake documentation, and when she told me her story through her interpreter as to the reason how she came to be in our country, it was a tale not dissimilar to the tales we have heard already today. And she showed me her wrists, and I remember that. She haunts me. She showed me her wrists, and they bore the scars, the physical scars of her experience in a brothel that she had managed to escape. Now, I'm genuinely so pleased that now we have a situation whereas previously she was treated as a criminal for having documentation papers that weren't legitimate, now I have complete confidence that she would be picked up, put into the national referral mechanism and treated as a victim, supported through her journey to a better life. And so all of these people and the many, many other women we have heard about, I think, are sitting here in this chamber as we debate this topic today. But I have to, as a minister, I have to proceed on the basis not just of compelling, heartbreaking stories. I have to proceed on the basis of evidence. And this is why we have commissioned research through the University of Bristol to understand the scale and nature of prostitution in the 21st century. We know it is different from how it was 10 years ago, and we know that because of the proliferation of these online sites that the Honourable Member for Rotherham described, and which I will deal with in a moment. But we have to, if I may, I'm just going to finish, I have to proceed on that basis. Of course, I'll give way.
You said that you would look at the legislation in Northern Ireland, and within the research that you've referred to just there now, could I suggest to the Minister that those who are doing the research very clearly look at what Northern Ireland has done, the change that it has made, and the evidence which has shown that there's a change in attitude as well, and the success of that, please?
I mean, we've been very careful. It is a team of academics who have who respected academics in the field, and I obviously don't want to, it wouldn't be right for me as a minister to sort of point them in the direction of their research, but I'm sure that they will be looking at that as they're looking at other examples across Europe, and it's something I myself can look at, of course, as well. And I'm conscious as well that before I descend into the detail, I'm really pleased as well that colleagues have talked about the role of demand in this and the role that education has Colleagues will know this is something that I spend a lot of time talking about when it comes to the way in which some crimes are perpetuated against women and girls. And the importance of relationships education is absolutely key to this. The honourable friend for Rotherham mentioned the Secretary of State for Education. My understanding is that whilst we know that some schools will be in a position to do this very quickly because they have the teachers and the skill sets available, other schools aren't quite at that place. And so we're trying to help them get to that place so that the quality and consistency of the policy is across the country. And so the position on prostitution, that the acts of buying and selling sex are not in themselves illegal in England and Wales, but there are many activities that can be associated with prostitution which are offences, and indeed we've heard of them today. And the basis for those offences when they were designed was to protect vulnerable people involved in prostitution, and it relates to activities, for example, such as controlling prostitution or buying sex from someone who has been a victim of trafficking. We know and are very aware of the different legislative approaches taken elsewhere. Of course, this includes the Nordic model, but also the regulated, decriminalised approach in Germany and in the Netherlands. We are seeking unequivocal evidence as to which approach, or any one approach, is better at tackling harm and exploitation. That must remain our priority.
She's extremely generous, and she, of course, has referred to the research that's going ahead. Would she not agree that if a large number of women that are involved in prostitution are very clearly being exploited by however we define that, that a small minority that appear to work relatively freely and not under those same conditions shouldn't be able to win a situation where a huge number of people are being exploited? Shouldn't public policy seek to reduce the impact on the most vulnerable first and foremost?
Yeah. A perfectly fair and proper question, and it's a question that I will have to answer when we have this research, which is independent, and we will be able to analyse the results of that. I know that colleagues are anxious to act immediately on this, and I understand why. But I'm in the position where I have to act on the basis of academic research and evidence. Of course, I'll give way.
I know that you can't direct them, but I have read various reports in my time working in this field, and Amnesty being one of the examples that often gets cited against my own particular viewpoint. As somebody who worked with women in the national referral mechanism, can you ensure that women in the national referral mechanism, which the government has access to, are taken account of in this research? Because I don't remember a single one of the trafficked women ever being asked their opinion in any research piece that I had ever seen.
As I said, I'm conscious of the independence of the researchers, and for the research to have, if you like, to be given the weight and the respect that I hope and expect it will be given, I'm a little bit cautious about me trying to interfere. But I am very conscious with my modern slavery responsibilities as to the impact of sex trafficking on people in the NRM. And so there is that body of evidence there as well. She's absolutely right to point it out. I'm conscious, Mr. Chairman, of time, and I want to give time to the members opposite to respond, but I'm grateful. The honourable members have spoken compellingly about what can be done by criminal gangs who traffic and pimp women. And we are looking at whether prohibition is the most effective policy response to that. We know that there are some evaluations and research that point to both the benefits and negative impacts of the Nordic model. It's a very contentious area, and there is a lot of conflicting and contradictory evidence cited from all sides of the debate, which is why I'm having to tread the path I am at this point. But we are doing, as I say, more to develop our evidence base on this, and we have commissioned this research from the University of Bristol. We anticipate the research on this will take a year to complete, with a final report expected in April next year. And from that, we can then look at the evidence and analyse where the best approach is. We know that as I've said, the picture on prostitution has changed from how it was even 10 years ago, and we need to understand the nature and the scale of the issue so that we understand the potential consequences, both intended and unintended, of any changes to legislation in this area. Of course.
Bruce? She's responding very thoughtfully to the comments which have been made, but I wonder if she would give us her view as the Minister as to whether she agrees that fundamentally prostitution is exploitative, that the act of prostitution is a form of violence against women and girls. And I think whatever these researchers say, that is an issue, that is a view which we here, concerned about this matter, would be interested to know her view on, having heard this debate today.
My honourable friend puts me in a difficult position in that I have, given we have conducted this research, we are we're very clear that it has to be research that is respected across the spectrum of views, and that and that we will review it appropriately. So I don't feel able to give my personal view, given that I'm speaking on behalf of Her Majesty's government. I will say this, if I may. I sat on the Home Affairs Select Committee when it delivered there was a report some time ago into prostitution, and that report was, it came to a certain viewpoint. I would just say that there were many, many shades of view in that report. I feel it's right that I say that, so that colleagues know that. But we are very clear that, of course, we have got to help the victims, both in terms of protecting them and helping them leave prostitution and get back into a way of life that they seek outside of prostitution. And we're not waiting for the publication of this research for that to happen. We've provided more than £2 million to organisations supporting sex workers, including £650,000 from the Violence Against Women and Girls Service Transformation Fund to the Police and Crime Commissioner of Merseyside to provide a victim-focused service for sex workers who are victims and prostitutes and at risk of sexual or domestic violence and abuse, exploitation or human trafficking. I've used both words deliberately through my speech. Well, forgive me. In that case, may Hansard note when I've said sex workers, can we add prostitutes and vice versa? Because I don't want to fall over language as other honourable members have mentioned as well. We have, in addition to that, our focus on protecting victims extends to the Trusted Relationships Fund, which we launched in February, a £13 million fund. I'm sorry about my microphone, Mr. Chairman, it seems to be doing something. I haven't got Siri on me, just in case anyone is wondering. And this will provide funding over 4 years for initiatives to provide the most vulnerable young people from child sexual exploitation and wider forms of criminal exploitation. We've received more than 100 expressions of interest from local authorities which cover initiatives aimed at developing the protection and that builds resilience in children and increases the consistency and quality of support for children and young people at risk. May I turn now to the specifics of the government strategy to tackle sex trafficking facilitated via online classified sites, otherwise known as adult service sites. Our strategy comprises three main strands of activity. Firstly, the NCA are leading a multi-agency operational plan to investigate, disrupt and prevent sex trafficking facilitated via these websites. I have visited myself the unit at which this work is done. Again, I thank the officers involved in that work because these officers sit at computer screens, they see the websites, they read words very similar to words that have been already cited in this debate, and they have to then find a way of dealing with that, leave the office and go home to their loved ones. So my eternal thanks and gratitude to them for doing that. Secondly, the operational push is supported by the development and use of innovative technological capabilities to help identify trafficking online. And thirdly, in support of this work, the Home Office has spoken to the largest adult services websites operating in the UK so that they take a proactive role in identifying and preventing trafficking related material from being hosted. They have a responsibility, I'm very clear on that, and it is through engagement with these industries that we seek to ensure that they do what they should to ensure that their sites do not host criminal and exploitative behaviour. And so, colleagues have mentioned the United States approach. Alongside this work, we continue to monitor the impact in the US of the recent change in legislation there brought in by the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, or FOSTA. The Act gives sex trafficking victims more power to sue websites that knowingly support sex trafficking. Although such an approach has much to commend it at first blush, we are conscious of some emerging evidence that prohibition of these sites results in the displacement rather than the prevention of abuse and disperses trafficking-related advertisements across a myriad of smaller websites where it is harder to investigate. But we will keep looking at this and we will see whether there are lessons to be learned from that approach and from approaches elsewhere. I'm just about to finish so that she has a chance to respond.
Give my time to the Minister because I would really like you to answer three questions. One, will she legislate to make sure websites cannot financially benefit from exploited women? Two, will she stop criminalising women who are forced into prostitution? And three, will she criminalise both the buyers and those that force women and benefit from forcing women into prostitution?
2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, I haven't been able to note all the questions. May I put it this way? I suspect this is I hope it is, the first of a programme of debates that we will have on this in the intervening period whilst the research is being developed. May I take those questions away? Because she will appreciate I can't commit to legislate on my feet in Westminster Hall. May I undertake to write to her on those points? But she knows that with the work she has done in other areas, other subject matters, I'm always more than willing to listen. Indeed, it's my privilege to do so, and I will take away the questions she's asked. I will consider them, and we will see where we get. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The question is that the House has considered tackling the demand for commercial sexual exploitation. As many as are of the opinion say aye. On the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.